Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in to this little study today, and I just pray that you are enjoying this as much as I am. Doing the study and finding out just the treasure chest and the riches that are in God's Word today. And so we are in First Samuel chapter 10. And last week we had a little bit of a diversion as I shared with you something somewhat timely with the season that we're in, the Christmas season, about the government being on the shoulders of Saul, comparing that to Isaiah 9 and 6, where it said the government would be upon the shoulders of the Messiah, which we know is Jesus. So beautiful parallelism there that we see in the scriptures. And so today we pick up in more the traditional um, study that we're going through, and we see in verse 14, the theme changes. You remember 2 lessons ago as we were looking at what was going on in verse 13. I'll scroll back to that, that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul and he prophesied, and looking up the word of that was that he spoke in ecstasy. And we did kind of an in-depth study on that experience that Saul had, which was maybe a predecessor or a shadow, type and shadow of what the Lord was planning to do in his church, beginning on the day of Pentecost, of coming and living inside of them and speaking through them in ecstasy and other tongues as the Spirit gave the utterance. And so we go to verse 14, and now all of a sudden, boom, it just changes. The whole essence changes. We don't know how much time went on there, but obviously Saul was overcome with the Spirit of the Lord. And I know that, when this has happened in my life, it usually isn't something that you just want to turn on and off like a light switch. It's something that becomes a part of you, and you wish to remain in that spirit, and you really don't want it to leave. So I believe there was somewhat of a time lapse between verse 13 and verse 14. We don't know how long, but obviously this wasn't just a 30-second time lapse of these sequence of events happening in rapid fire succession, that there was a lapse in here where Saul was in God's presence with the prophets. Who knows how much time they spent together. Obviously, you get a group of like-minded people together who are in the Spirit of the Lord. Those meetings can last for hours. And so, some time went on here, but obviously the time does pass, and the narrative of the story needs to go on, because in the whole big picture of this is the Lord setting up what he wants to do next in Israel, and that is to bring them a king. And Saul, we know, will be that king. But what's interesting here is we get to verse 14, and remember how this all happened. The Lord set up which would appear to be a calamity or a tragedy in Saul's family, in his father's life, that his father's donkeys ran away, and sent Saul and a servant after them. That's how the narrative went to this point. Well, now we get to verse 14, and we see an uncle appear. And this is somewhat interesting, because it gives no impression before this that anybody other than Saul and his servant went to look for the donkeys. So, okay, where did this uncle come from? Was he sent by Saul's dad because he was so worried about them? But yet we see in a previous narrative that the donkeys had returned home and they were found. Samuel had told Saul this. So maybe in between that occurrence of the donkeys returning home and, Kish being worried about his son Saul, Kish sent his brother, which would have been Saul's uncle, to go and look for Saul, to look for the servants, and try to find out, what happened to them. He was beginning to worry, obviously, more about his son than he was the donkeys at this point. So here pops in this uncle. And what's really interesting is this word uncle is a very interesting word. It is dod, Dalet a Holam Vav, and another Dalet, and it's those are the letters that are here. And when we click on this in the concordance lexicon that we can look up, we see, of course, Dode. It and it has some very interesting meanings. Beloved, love, and then you throw uncle into there. What's really interesting is throughout most of the scriptures, and we look at how many times it was translated, it looks, 30, 40, 50, over 50 sometimes, maybe even close to 60 times that this word dode appears in the scriptures. And the majority of the time it's translated as beloved. Beloved, my love, lover, very intimate relationship, showing a great emotion of the heart and a great affection. And then you see uncle. It's actually in here 17 times, 18 times that it's uncle. And it's like, okay, how does this work? How does uncle fit into this? And there's a lot of commentary about how, that an uncle would have been the next member of the clan, that should the father have passed away, that the uncle would then have taken over the family responsibility, and that the uncle is normally, favored by the children. Um, and yeah, I guess you can see that, but we all have uncles that, well, maybe we have some beloved uncles, but we have some not so beloved uncles. And many families have that, way out there uncle, the strange one that doesn't seem to even fit in the family. I don't know if you have one of those too, um, but it's very interesting. So to me, it was a real stretch to associate the word uncle in the term beloved. So it is very, very interesting. So um, it also, when we look deeper into some of the commentaries, this is Brown Driver Briggs. He was a Hebrew Jewish scholar. And of course, he looks back into some of the origins of this word from the Assyrians, from the Syriac. It gives you the term of someone who was an endearment. Uh, and yes, uncle could fit in there, but I think it's quite strange. I don't have a real good explanation as to where this came from and what this really means here. But the word uncle or dode here can have some different meanings. We'll leave it as uncle, but I want to point out to you some other meanings that are quite interesting in the scripture. Um, the root word of this dode comes from the ability of, it says it comes from a pot of water that is boiling, that when water reaches that temperature, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, or 100 degrees Celsius, it begins to change its form and begins to boil. And it's that boiling um, essence that was the base of the root for forming this word of dode. And when we think of what we see in a pot and the boiling, it is easy to associate this with a romantic love, with a endearment, with a type of relationship that causes feelings to bubble up inside of you, similar to a boiling water in a water pot. That there's a feelings going on, things welling up inside of you, bubbling up. We use those terminologies today, and we understand them a lot. You feel your heart burn with passion. Very easily to relate to the water boiling in a pot. And so we see that connection there. Again, not sure how it goes to uncle, but I'm going to kind of gravitate a little bit away from the translation of uncle and go back to the majority of the translations that are used for this word dode, and that is beloved, and talk a little bit about that because there's some beautiful comparisons given here that you'll see through the scriptures, especially when you start to read the Psalms later on. And if you read them in the Hebrew, or when you're reading in English and you come across words that are used quite often by David in the Psalms, called beloved and loved or beloved in the Psalms, you'll see that. And I want to give you a little bit of a basis for that because one of the root words of David's name, David, is the letters Dalet, the Vav, only used in slightly different form. It doesn't have the O sound, but it has the A sound, and then it begins with the letter Dalet again. So the word David or David is based upon this word Dode. And David was named with this in mind, and that he was beloved. Beautiful story of David we'll get into a little bit later when this narrative gets to David on how he was conceived, how he came to be, some Jewish folklore as to why he was despised by his brothers, but very loved of his father. And again, there's a very strange relationship there that'll come out when we reach that point. But David's name was based upon this word. Dode, and you'll see that he uses it extensively in the writings of the Psalms, and I believe it plays into a little bit later on when we understand when the Lord speaks of David, that David was beloved of the Lord, no doubt there, and that he was a man after God's own heart. And I believe that all played into this word of Dode. In fact, if you listen to some Hebrew poetry or listen to some Hebrew songs, you'll hear a word called Dodi. In fact, it's even common nickname or a girl's name for that matter to hear some women called Dottie or Doti or Dodi, especially in Jewish circles, and that would fit into my beloved, my cherished one, my favored one. And so, very, very interesting root meanings again to these words that help set just the tone for what is about to happen here. So, as we leave that thought and go on, we see that you get two verses about Saul's uncle, and then poof, he's gone. You never hear about him again. Although there is some Jewish commentary that writes that this uncle may have been Ner, that's spelled Ner. You will see that name come up later when Saul forms his armies and Ner becomes a captain of the army, and that this was a valiant man who served mightily in the Hebrew military and fought mighty battles, that it was Saul's uncle, and this may have been Ner coming to look for Saul and getting some exposure to what was happening in Saul's life. Because again, we have the Bible and we read it and we kind of know what's going on, but they didn't. It was playing out minute by minute, and again, this had never happened before, and so the whole episode was new to them, and they were very uncertain. New territory, new ground being covered, a king coming to Israel, something that had never happened before. And so, as we follow with that thought, we see some very interesting things. And so, the uncle comes to him and begins his little interchange with the servant. Where'd you go? We're looking for you. Where have you been? What's been going on? Obviously concern and worry. And so they're trying to talk this out and talk about the donkeys. And, we couldn't find them. And verse 15, um, you know, Saul explains that he went to Samuel to inquire, and of course, this really piqued the interest of Saul's uncle, if we assume that he is Ner, and because you just don't go to the prophet without hearing something profound. And then everybody wants to know, what did the prophet tell you? It's like if you would say, well, I went to, you know, this city, big city, and I met with the mayor, or I went to, to take a tour of the governor's uh, mansion, and I met the governor and his wife, or I was walking through the state capitol and all of a sudden the governor comes out and meets me, or I'm, touring, the White House, and all of a sudden I run into the president. People want to say, well, what was it like? What did you see? What did he tell you? What did you talk about? That same type of attitude and scenario is happening here when Nair finds out that Saul talked with Samuel. So he says, please tell me, what did he say? What did Samuel say to you? I want to know every detail. I want to know everything that's going on. But look how Saul answers in verse 16. And Saul just talked about the donkeys. He did not say anything about the encounter and the prophecy. He didn't tell him about his experience with God, where he prophesied. He pushed that all aside. Um, that's very interesting. He just said, "Oh, yeah, Samuel told us the donkeys had been found, but for the matter of the kingdom, he did not tell his uncle what Samuel had told him." Now, you can wonder, how could he even do this? Why wouldn't he be so excited? Well, you remember that Samuel did charge him and admonish him to not tell anybody what was going on. They wanted to allow God to um, have a setting of the stage. They wanted God to reveal this because it was very important that the people know that this was God's doing. And so God had a series of events that he wished to outline for them. And so that they would have confidence and assurance that this was a choice brought about by God himself. And so it goes into some narrative here, verse 17. It seems that we don't know what happened to Saul's uncle. Did he go back home? Did he hang around with them? But here was something that Samuel called all the people of the Lord together. Kind of interesting. It doesn't say he went and called all Israel together. It said he called uh, the people of the Lord together. And I like that. Again, Samuel is not in favor of having a king. God is not in favor of having a king. And he wants to still keep a spiritual component in this and keep God in the midst of this as much as he can. And so how this, again, how much time went on in verse 17? This was before social media and satellite communications, and even before Pony Express and telegraph and all of those things, and radio. So how do you get the word out to all of Israel? How do you get it out to them and have them gather together? And it's one thing to write this all down, give it to, a dozen guys on camels and donkeys and have them head to all the cities and make a proclamation, kind of like we see, hear ye, and let them know. But this all took time. First they'd have to get it there, which could have taken a week, and then people would have to prepare to make the journey to come to Mitzpah and hear this proclamation. And why would they just come because Samuel told them? There had to be some sort of expectation. How many times do we get invited or are made known of something and we don't deem it important enough to even attend? We'll say, oh, we'll find out later what went on. But something about this and whatever Samuel wrote to the people caused them all to gather together at Mitzpah. And again, Mizpah, I think, is quite fitting. Remember, we did that study on it a few weeks ago, that this is a place where they gather together, and the word mitzvah itself sometimes, it is translated as watchtower, or a tower of watching for enemies to come, but really has the meaning of watching out, of a place where two people who have a relationship are dear to each other's heart, and they have great care and love for each other, and so they are concerned about each other's welfare. And so, just the fact that you see the word Yahweh, which is the name of God used when he's showing his mercy, his compassion, when his heart is out there, is connected to this word mitzvah, tells me that God is still so desirous to be a part of his people and watch out for them and have this relationship to where he wants to keep them close and keep them under his protection, and hoping through all of this that they will do the same. So we get to verse 18. They met at Mizpah, and Samuel is saying to the children, again, interesting here, he uses the word sons of Israel, and again uses the word Yahweh, meaning the compassionate aspect of God, that Yahweh, Elohi of Israel, um, and sets a little bit of a stage. He's just not going to pop up and say, okay, you want a king? Here's a king. He's setting a stage. He wants them to realize what they're doing. I think this is still an avenue whereby the people could have changed the course of direction. So he gives them this opportunity. So he says, here's God's heart speaking, saying, I brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I delivered you from the hand of Pharaoh and all the kingdoms that came to oppress you while you were wandering in the wilderness. I protected you. I fed you. I was your everything. I was your king. But now today you've rejected me. You've rejected your God who saved you from all your tribulations, saved you from all your adversaries, and you've turned away from him and you said, no, we want a king to be set over us so that we can be like all other nations. And so Samuel is saying, this isn't what God wanted, but this is giving you what you are asking for. And so they go into a mode that is quite interesting of how they are going to use this, what's about to happen here, to uh, tell the people and to somehow convince them and give them confidence that God is in the midst of this and God is making this selection. And so they draw together and they cast lots. Um, Now, this is really something that we don't ascribe to in our Western mindset. In our relationship with God, we think it's something that's very dangerous. People do what's called Bible roulette, where they take the Bible and flip it open, and wherever it falls, they point their finger. And some people will say, "Well, this is God's message for me." And of course, there are all kinds of humorous stories about them stopping and pointing to scriptures that are quite contrary to giving them the answer that they want, and may lead them in a very dangerous spot. And I'm sure, familiar with some of those things. Not that some people haven't been spoken to that way, but it is certainly not found in the scriptures to be a recommended way of communication. But yet here they cast lots. They do something very similar. They present themselves before Yahweh. Again, very significant that in the Hebrew it uses the word Yahweh and not Elohim. Still talking about the compassionate, merciful side of God. They're supposed to come together in their tribes and in their clans, and they come near to Samuel. And what they actually do is um, put their names of the clans on a piece of parchment and put it in a bag, and Samuel reaches his hand in and pulls out a piece of parchment similar to paper, although it was animal skin parchment. They didn't have paper the way we know it today, and pulls out whatever name is on this parchment in this bag. It's a lottery. It's the casting lots. We're all familiar with that terminology. But to think that this was being done to select a king, and that even though God had revealed to Samuel that Saul was being chosen, and you think that would have been enough. Samuel could have stood up and said, God spoke to me. God revealed to me that Saul was going to be king. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul. All the prophets saw it. I saw it. Uh, you know, that's enough confirmation for me. That would have been enough. But here he uses a secondary confirmation that in the midst of these 12 tribes, obviously there'd be the 12 tribes that come. So the first lot here, where it says by your tribes, that's where they pick one of the 12. Then out of that tribe, one of the clans. How many clans were there? There could have been dozens and dozens of clans, each putting their name on. And Samuel puts his hand in the bag and pulls out a name. And that's how this lot went. And so, verse 20, it says they caused the tribes of Israel to come, and the names went on, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken. And so, okay, Benjamin was chosen. All the members of the tribe of Benjamin, all the leaders of the different clans, the different families that were all part of Benjamin, come again and get a piece of parchment and write their family name on and throw it in a bag. And Samuel sticks his hand in the bag and pulls out a name. And out of the tribe of Benjamin and their families, there was the family of Matri. Okay, then everybody stops. Everybody from the family of Matri gets together in a little huddle, and there's leaders there, and the patriarchs of that family of the ancestry of Matri write their names down on a little piece of parchment. Again, put it in a bag. Samuel sticks his hand in the bag, and out comes the family of Kish. And then they do it again, and particularly from there, out comes the name of Saul. Now, this took a lot of time, and there was a lot of emotion. You can imagine they didn't quite know they knew something grand and wonderful was happening here. A lot of emotion built up, and this took hours for this to take place, to get the people together and make this all happen. And then you have the disappointment of the tribes and the families that weren't chosen. Then you have the excitement of the family and tribes that were chosen as they're anticipating, how their whole nation was going to change. It's like an election night outcome. They're watching state by state, and I believe that same type of, we have just went through an election again, of course, a very emotional one. And I believe all that sort of emotion was frothed within this exchange and this what was happening here as Samuel was going and picking their next leader, their next king. And suddenly they pull out the last one, and the name of Saul is chosen. Now, look at how miraculous this was, that out of those, I don't know how you'd calculate the probability. I'm sure you could if you know that there's 12 tribes, so you got a 1 in 12 chance of pulling out the name of Benjamin. But out of the tribes of Benjamin, out of the families of Benjamin, you don't know how many clans there were. There could have been 50, there could have been 100 by that time. And then from there, you pull out the names. The um, probability of being able to pick consistently those names out of a hat, out of a bag, to match what God's will was, this was an incredible miracle. I don't believe this was lost on them. I believe Samuel was explaining this, and that they were full aware of the miracle that God was working to confirm his word in a way that they would understand. This occurrence was not just happenstance. The probability of it happening was just astronomical. This was a miracle of God, that these names were being picked. And so all the time, this feeling and momentum is building, and it became too much for Saul. I believe Saul had an attitude. He had an ego. We're going to find out later that he was a big, tough guy, taller than everybody else. The scriptures say he was very handsome, and normally all that combination does not lead to a humble person, does not lead to someone who runs away from the limelight, but who loves to be in the limelight, who's very brash and bold, and loves to be the center of attention and the life of the party. Well, as this was building, this momentum, this emotion had a humbling effect on Saul. And when he realized that this was really going to happen, that he was going to be chosen king, all of his failures and doubts started to come upon him, and he went and hid himself. Because when his name came out and everybody's looking to, crown him as king and cheer him and lift him up on their shoulders, they could not find him. And this was kind of interesting. Again, how do you lose a big guy like that? How do you lose him in the midst where, he was there for a while, people saw him, and then all of a sudden he disappeared, and they had to have looked, because they reached the point where they physically could not find him. Nobody could find him, and they had to go inquire of the Lord. Again, very interesting what they must have reached, the desperation they must have gotten to before they decided, well, we can't find him. God's chosen him. God must know where he is. God must know. Obviously, he's not going to be never found, because that would be out of the will and plan and purpose of God. So all of these wonderful thoughts here of how, if God has a plan and a purpose for your life, God will bring it to fruition. And so they inquire of the Lord, and the Lord answered them. And again, this is, just think of this. How did God answer them? How did this voice appear, um, or come out? Was it only to Samuel? That would obviously be our first thought, is that Samuel, with his deep connection and relationship with God, that God would have put it upon Samuel's heart, and Samuel would have been directed by, spiritual GPS to know where, where Saul was. But it says that he answered. It uses the word vayomer, means and he spoke. Really, that and God spoke. There were words mentioned, whether they were audible or whether they were felt inwardly. We don't know, and it doesn't say who heard it. Did all the people hear it? It gives the impression that they all heard it and they all went to look for him at one time. And the Lord says he's hidden. King James says it kind of interesting. He's hidden among the stuff. Well, it uses the word equipment. And let's just look that up to see what kind of equipment he was hidden among. He was in the kitchen. He was in the place where the utensils and the vessels were kept for cooking. Um, Again, a very broad terminology of where Saul could have been. One of the number one uses is armor, but it's also just article. It's could be earthenware, furnishings, jars, utensils, vessels. There are more cases of vessels and utensils used, which give you the impression that he was in the cafeteria. He was hiding back in the cooler where all the food was and where all the jars were. I think it was wherever he thought he could be the best hidden is where he went. Wherever he thought he could get the greatest amount of uh, coverage and not be found. So again, a very interesting. So maybe the word stuff is the best translation, even though it is quite strange. But they don't know what kind of equipment it was, but it was stuff. There were things that were just piled up, and he was able to hide behind. And so they ran and brought him from there. And of course, not everybody knew him or were acquainted with him. And then here's where the shock and awe factor comes in, that he stood among the people and he was taller than any of the people. Again, very interesting. It uses this, you'll say head and shoulders, that his head was higher above the rest. The word head is not really in here anywhere. It uses the word gadol, which is translated into taller. It just means bigger. So we understand he was bigger, but then the next word of Kasho gives us an understanding that it was from his shoulders and upward that he was bigger. So that's where the translation of taller comes into. It's assumed because he was bigger from the shoulders upward. Again, what gives you an indication of what the translators have to go through in order to convey the meaning and the message, because the words are not always as clear. And so here is Saul standing up taller than everybody else, and you know, Samuel's making the presentation. Do you see him? He's the one that God has chosen. There's no one like him from among all the people. A little bit of PR going on here, of making the people, trying to get them over to the side of what's really happening now. This is God's will. This is God's plan. Even if they don't really like all what's happening, this is what God is doing. And all the people shouted with a long shout, "Long live the king!" Very interesting. That must As it was a common cliche back then, it is also today. And then we get to verse 25 as we kind of close out the chapter, that Samuel explained again, gave them a whole nother explanation of what this king was going to do. Basically saying, you made a bad choice. You're getting what God gave you, but mark my words, this is going to happen. And so he rehearses all of this again. And it doesn't go into detail, but it says that he did speak it to them, and he wrote it in a book, which we understand as being the book of Chronicles, and wrote this all down, and put it in the house of God, laid it up before Yahweh. Again, this is a contract. This is evidence here of what God really wanted, what God acquiesced to give the people, and now they got their king. Poof, here you are. Take over, Saul, and be king. Never having been king before, has no kingly background, didn't graduate from king training school, didn't have any background whatsoever, and now he's king. I can understand why he was a little scared. So Samuel sent away all the people, every man to his house, and Saul went home too. Like, okay, what am I going to do now? I got to take some time to figure this all out. Um, would have thought he would have stuck by Samuel, and to me, the proper course of action would have been go to the house of God, pray, ask God for guidance, deliverance. Lord, help me to write a constitution or an outline of how to be king or something like that. But Saul went to his own home. And with them were some valiant men. There was a lot going on here. It says these were men whose hearts God had touched and put in their hearts to protect him, to be his advisors, to help him organize and get things going. So I guess in a way, God did do something here to start Saul on his way by touching these men's hearts, by pricking them, and putting something in there that they would trust him, and leave their homes, leave their families, and now suddenly be part of the king's court. What's kind of interesting here is obviously not everyone thought this was a good idea. And what I find interesting is how these people who dissented were called sons of Belial, which means they were people who were contrary to God's will. And they said, how can this man save us? And they despised him, and they didn't bring him any presents. But Saul kept his peace. He didn't shout accusations at him, didn't say, well, I'm going to kill you, banish you. He, at this time, was acting in a very diplomatic, very leadership type role, held his peace, know that people are going to say things about him, and he didn't lash back in kind. And so, again, very, very interesting. Took a little longer for me to go through this than I had anticipated. But it brings us to the end of chapter 10. I hope you enjoyed this study and can see how God's miraculous, marvelous hand is in this whole situation. And we'll pick up a little bit on the tail end of this, chapter 10, when we come back together next week, and then go into chapter 11. So God bless you. Hope you enjoy this message. Have yourself a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and may God be with you. God bless you. Amen.